Hi everyone, welcome. I'm really happy to be here today. And as was already mentioned, today we're going to talk about automation and some of the worst mistakes you can make while doing automation. I'm just saying some because, well, there can be quite a few. But that I've either experienced myself or seen other people, going through these things. First of all, as it was mentioned, I've worked a lot on different kinds of projects in different kinds of domains. I've done mostly automation with Java, Selenium, and then other frameworks like TestNG, JUnit, Maven, and so on. So I have quite a lot of experience on different types of projects with different setups for the team and so on. And some of the common things I've seen, and let's go through them, is that when we start doing automation, we don't always start after we read the documentation. So we don't always focus on properly understanding how we are supposed to use a tool or how we're supposed to write the code. We just start writing the code, and then what happens is that in many cases we just end up with way too much code, with not very well organized tests if we are using a tool. And in the end, it might lead to code or to the tests not being usable or used because they take too much time to run. There's too much code and nobody understands what's there. The tests don't even pass when they're supposed to pass, or they don't fail when they're supposed to fail. So it's kind of a mess. So the first thing we need to do before we start creating our automated tests is to read the official documentation, because that is the starting point when it comes to any framework or tool. The people who wrote that tool or the framework know best how to use that. And so we need to learn from their documentation. And of course, if that doesn't help us, then if the documentation is not exactly properly written, then maybe the tool isn't that great either. So a good documentation is kind of also relevant of how good the tool you're using is. Once we've managed to get familiar with the tools and the framework, we need to start writing the code or the tests, and we need to do so in an organized way. We need to make sure that everybody on the team has the same behavior when it comes to creating the tests. Everybody has or is following the same pattern for naming things. This is just one of the things. Why is this important? Well, when somebody comes into the project and they want to create something, they need to be aware whether that was already created or not, because otherwise we're just going to have duplicates. So if we follow a certain naming pattern, it's also easier for us to find things in the project because we know what pattern to look for. We also need to make sure all the code and utilities and whatever else we have when it comes to the tests are placed in the correct place. So, for example, when it comes to a Java project, of course, all of the tests are in the test folder, and any utility you have for your Java tests can be placed in the main folder. And of course, you can group things by packages, and each package can represent maybe a feature or the fact that it relates to regression or sanity or something like that. So it's very important to know where to find things. Also, many times we don't care about typos. So we just type some text there, and even though we have a typo in the text, we don't care about that. And that will also make it very difficult for other people to find what they're looking for in the framework, because they would be looking for something with a certain name. And if you spell the name incorrectly, and you have already created the code that they need, they won't be able to find it. So they won't know that the code is already there, and they will start writing the same thing all over again. So this again leads to the duplicates that I mentioned. And another thing we sometimes do when we are creating our tests is we're kind of breaking rules, and we're just saying, okay, I'm just doing this just this once. It's just the one time. And this one time will be yet another time and another time and another time. And we are going to end up making the same mistakes and exceptions way too many times. So it's never a good idea to, break the rules. Let's standardize our projects and follow the rules and make sure that we have a clean project and clean tests that we can rely on. That is basically why we are doing this whole standardizing process. One other thing when it comes to code especially is that when people write tests and utilities for their tests, they are not performing code reviews. So it's either that they are not participating in other people's code reviews, or they are not creating code reviews for their own code. And that's really bad. That just means you're working in isolation and nobody is aware of what you are doing. Nobody is aware that you are creating some content that other people can use. Code reviews, basically, of course, you get feedback for what you've written. So people will suggest maybe improvements regarding the code you wrote, or they can get inspired by what you are writing. So maybe they can improve their own code writing in the future, but they are also more aware of what goes into the test framework. So they are aware of different pieces that they can also use when they are creating their own tests. That's why I'm saying don't skip code reviews, even if you might be afraid that you will get some feedback that you won't be very happy about. It's a learning process and it's a sharing process. So that's why code reviews are extremely important when it comes to creating our automated tests. Another thing, when you're especially starting a brand new automation project, is that you need to know that the software you are testing is actually automatable. Because in some cases, we have all kinds of legacy pages, and we have frames embedded in other frames, and we have all kinds of weird things that are going on, let's say on a web page that we might need to automate. So it's really a good idea to actually find out if the software we want to test is automatable. And we also need to pick the right framework for doing the automation. For that, we should do a POC, which means proof of concept. And what we need to do there is very simple. We just need to pick certain scenarios that we want to automate as a demo. So we want to create scenarios, which, of course, if the demo is successful, can also be considered valid tests that we can already start running. And we should pick some of the scenarios that are most relevant for telling us, is this software automatable? We should pick some very basic scenarios, and we should also pick some very complex ones. And by complex, I mean you should go through different types of page setup or elements that are included in the page. For example, as I said, legacy pages, all kinds of exotic, let's say, languages which were used to create some bits of the page, iframes, and so on. So everything that is not really straightforward, like clicking a button. Those should be included in the POC just to see, if you can do an end-to-end test. Because if you can only do a part of it, you could choose then to not do the automation at all, or you could just choose to pick some parts of the automation. But still, you could automate a chunk of everything, and that would also be a gain. You will have more tests you can run, and you have a better way of automatically validating your software. And when you're doing the POC, you can also see how easy it is to write the tests. You can see whether, doing an end-to-end scenario is very easy. Like, do you need a lot of setup? Do you need a lot of utilities to be written? Do you need to adjust your timings and so on? Like, when you're creating Selenium tests, do you need to add a lot of weight in your tests? These are the things you can see when you're creating the POC. And another thing you can see is how long it will actually take to write the tests. Because if it takes 2 weeks to automate a very basic scenario, then you're definitely not using the right tool, or maybe it's not worth investing in automation for that software that you want to automate. So this can tell you that maybe you should try a different tool or framework to do the automation, or that, as I said, maybe automation is not really something you will need to do for this particular project. POCs are very, very good. As I said, sometimes the POC can be the starting point for actually creating the framework and all of the tests that you need, or they can help, like it was in my case, they can help with adjusting or improving some parts of maybe another framework or another project's tests. As I mentioned, maybe we are using the wrong framework. Maybe we choose a framework simply because it's hyped, because everybody's talking about it, because we've seen a lot about that framework somewhere. But if the framework is not suited for our testing needs, What will happen is that we will start creating, or at least we will try to create a suite of tests, and then we will try to create even more, and we will struggle with actually creating those tests and to having them, be reliable and be runnable. And then after we've spent time creating all of these tests, we will spend even more time trying to get rid of the tests and actually migrate them to a framework where these tests can actually run. So it's really no use in choosing a framework just because we've heard about it. We need to make sure it suits our needs. Otherwise, we're just doing a lot of work in vain, which we will eventually also have to rewrite and redo. So not a good option. One of the worst things I've seen actually is not updating bad code. So in some cases, you have like a method, a utility method, let's say, that is doing something, but we realize it's either not doing the proper thing, or that it can be improved, or that certain steps need to be added, or certain steps need to be removed, and so on. And sometimes we're going to say, oh, we're not going to change this because it's already used in 20 places. Now, what happens is that if you catch it early on, it's easier to update and it's easier to remove the usages for this particular method, because 20 usages is not that much. However, if you leave that bad code there and you don't do anything about it, a few years later you can end up with maybe 1,000 usages. And this is a true story, so I've seen this happen quite a few times. Once you are very, very deep in using that part of the piece of code, it's really difficult to get rid of it. And it's going to affect the performance of your framework in some cases, especially if this code is part of the overall framework architecture. You will see a lot of side effects that are going to kick in, and you might even end up with needing to rewrite the entire framework or to switch to an entirely new framework simply because the one that you're currently using is not at all functional anymore. It's not working anymore, and you cannot do anything with it anymore. So once you find that bad code, don't hesitate to change it, to improve it. And if it's really bad and you really don't need it, just remove it and remove all the usages as early as you can. The earlier you fix things, the less the cost for this change is going to be. When we start creating our tests, usually we have scenarios that might be very, very long. So it's not just one step, it may be 20 steps, 30 steps, and so on. When we create the tests, we have this tendency of wanting to create the entire automated test at once. So we know exactly what the steps are, and we're just going to write all the steps and just run the test when we are done with all the steps. But because we're doing this, we can have many random failure points. And it's going to be more difficult to debug an entire test made up of 30 steps instead of doing bits by bit. So what I like to do is just start with a few of these steps. So create the code for them, run the code, run it several times to make sure it runs properly, and only then add the next steps. Of course, once I add the next steps, I rerun the entire test. And here, by doing this rerun, I can actually make sure that the first steps that I created are reliable, because I run them many, many times, and so I get more information regarding whether they are passing properly or if there is some point in those steps where we have a random failure. So small steps. Of course, at one point we will have the entire test running there, but by the time when we're going to run the last steps, we will be quite sure that the first steps before those last ones are reliable because we already ran them quite a few times. So our tests will be more reliable the moment we will commit them to the repository and have them run, for example, in a Jenkins instance. Yeah, so of course we know the story with the randomly failing tests, so-called flaky tests. I see that people are very happy to have this kind of randomly failing tests and just add retries on top of them. So you're just going to have a test, it's going to fail the first time, but then you will do an automatic retry to see that on the second run it will pass. And many times we won't spend time fixing the bug, the problem in the test, so to say. We just want to leave them like that. Retrying is okay for us. We just accept that, okay, the first time it was just some random failure. The second time means, okay, if the second time it passed, then it's definitely okay. This can lead to some of the real test failures being overlooked, because in some cases, when the test failed initially, it actually failed for a reason. And we should have investigated why the test failed in the first reason, not just do the retry and be happy with the fact that on the second try it worked. Instead of doing this, we should work on creating tests that are reliable, tests that are not flaky. And that means a reliable test should be the one that when there is no change in the software and there is no change in the environment, and we run the same test, I don't know how many times, let's say 5 times, every single time we run the test, it will give the same result. It will not randomly fail anywhere within its steps. If we have such a reliable test, then that is what we want. That is exactly the way a test should be. If one of those 5 test runs gave us a different result, that means we still need to tweak the test and to make sure that it's reliable, because in case it's failing randomly, it's flaky. And at one point, it can end up being considered an irrelevant test because we cannot really rely on it. We don't know when it's going to randomly fail, so it's not going to give us too much good information. The test can just be thrown away unless we fix it and we make it a reliable test. And if we have the reliable test, then it's going to be a valuable one, and it will be able to properly validate our software every time we have a release or every time we are running that particular test. Something else that people don't necessarily pay attention to is documenting the project. So, when we're working on a project, we are kind of used to doing that. We know how to set it up, we know how to run the tests, and so on. But think about what happens if you have a new joiner to the team, or if somebody is going to, if the project is sent out to become a maintenance project and you're no longer working on it, you will need to train somebody else on how to use the project. And instead of having to teach every new person coming to the team about how this framework works, and instead of forgetting certain things, because even if you're working on a project, sometimes you're forgetting some of the quirks of the project, it's better to actually document everything, to have a Confluence page, for example, and anytime you need a reference, you can just go there and read about how the project works. And especially if you have new joiners or you're handing over the project to someone else, you can just hand it over with the documentation, have the people run the documentation, read the documentation, and only if they have some, unclarities, only then they should come back to you and ask you about the setup. So it's easier for you to have other people working on the project instead of you spending the time to actually train the people on how to use it. Prioritizing the test is something that's coming up quite a lot. So if we need to create automated tests, of course, we need to start with the most important ones. So we need to prioritize our tests so that, because we don't have enough time to work on them, of course, we always start with the most important ones. And having the most important ones automated, that means we have a very important gain. We always have a, let's say, small suite of tests that we can run already, which will validate the key points of the software. If we're starting with the least important tests, and if we run those are not going to help us much, because even if they would find a bug, let's say, it will not be a very important bug, or it will not be something that necessarily needs early investigation or fast investigation. On the other hand, if you're starting with the most important ones, with the most priority tests, then you have those tests. You can run them as part of the Jenkins job, for example. And if they fail, you can easily say, okay, now we're going to focus on fixing that bug because it's a critical feature. And if there is a bug in the critical feature, that needs to be prioritized as the top thing we're going to work on. Because, of course, high priority means very important, means possible loss of income from the customers. And if you don't have time, for example, in the sprint to automate what you are planning to automate, you can just create some Jira tickets and you can address those tickets somewhere in the next sprint. Creating the Jira tickets means you will not forget about the test cases you want to automate, and you can pick them up whenever you have some time. For example, if you're working in sprints, sometimes at the beginning of the sprint, you don't have a lot of work because the developers didn't commit anything yet. So they didn't finish anything for you to test yet. So that means you would have some time to take on some of the Jira tickets for doing automation. So you can bring value for your automation by spending that time focusing on these tickets that you created. So you're reducing your automation debt by doing this. And something else we are a lot, us testers, is very sentimental when it comes to the tests we've created, meaning that even though we have some tests which are no longer used, we have used them at one point, now the feature is either not there anymore, or simply there's another version of the test that is better and we should run that one. When it comes to the old tests, we don't want to delete them. We simply want to keep them there just for future reference or something like that. What I would recommend is, in this case, to just delete them, because we are working with version control systems like Git or Perforce or something like that, and they do have a history. So even though we delete a file, it's not gone forever. We can easily go back and see the version we had at certain time frames or in certain points in time. We can see and we can recover some of the files that we deleted. So that's not really a problem. Having a lot of files in the project simply means that, for example, if you are syncing with the repository, it's going to be very, very slow at one point because you will have tons and tons and tons of files which you need to synchronize and to download from the repository. So the less files you will have, of course, if you have only useful files, then it's going to be more easy and faster to sync with the project, with the repository. If for some reason you simply don't want to delete them, you could at least move them to a dedicated folder, an obsolete folder, let's say, from where they are not ever run and they are not, doing any harm and they are not impeding your work because somebody found them and they're trying to run them and they realize, okay, after 2 hours, okay, these weren't the correct tests. So yeah, time wasted. One other thing is that even though we create a lot of tests, sometimes we don't run them. We create tests during the sprint because we have to, because we have new features that we're working on and we have a target to do automation and so on. But sometimes, even though we created the tests, we just leave them there. Instead, once you've created your tests, they're going to help you with future releases, because running the tests before a release will make sure to highlight any bugs you have in features that maybe you're not releasing any changes for, but they are still there. You can run the tests, especially if you have a Jenkins machine or Docker, anytime you want. You can run them, for example, as a strategy. If you have medium duration tests, so if they take a few hours, you could run them on a nightly basis. If you have tests that run for a day or 2 days, you can run them during the weekend, or you can find certain timeframes when to run them, but don't forget about them. Run them as often as you can, because if you've already written them, then they have some, or they're bringing some value to your project. So don't forget about them. Use them. You spend time creating them, now spend some time running them and analyzing the results. And of course, if your tests are reliable, the failures will only highlight the fact that you have a problem in your system. One other thing I want to highlight is that when we are creating our automated tests, we are using some IDE. My preferred one is IntelliJ. We are not always using the IDE to its maximum potential, because the IDE can help us with a lot of shortcuts. It has auto completion. It can auto generate code for us. And of course, it can help us see what improvements we can do to our code by using code analysis. So I recommend for you, if you haven't already, to take the IntelliJ course I have created. There is a link here. This is on the Test Automation University platform, and it will show you how to properly use the IDE to make your running and creating tests faster. So this is a very good way to get familiar with how to use IntelliJ as testers. So this is dedicated to our day-to-day work as testers. So check it out. One more thing, creating an in-house framework is never a good idea. I have seen companies try to create tools similar to something that you already have on the market, or programming languages or something like that. But that's not a good idea, because it will take months or years to create a good, properly working product, just as every company who creates a tool is doing. And just, you know, if you're thinking about those companies, they have a lot of requirements for their software that they're building. They have a lot of implementation, so a lot of people working on the framework. They need to properly test the framework because before they're launching it. So doing the same in your company just for your testing purposes is really not worth it, unless you really don't have another tool that can help you out. If you do, you should pick an already existing tool and not in-house create a brand new framework, because it's going to take too much time and the results might not be very good in the end. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for the patience and sticking around with me. Let's see if we have any questions. Oh, wow, we do. Oh, wow, okay. Okay, so what to do if you are only one tester working on automation project? Get help. You can also enlist the help from developers, because they can also, if they're developers, they know the project, they know sometimes you're using the same programming languages as they do, so they can help you out by picking some of the tickets that I mentioned that you have created for your automation dev, and they can start working on them with you. And of course, at the beginning, you can stay close to them and show them how to do things until they are familiar. And because you're doing code review, you will always make sure that what they are testing is correct, so that the tests are the expected ones from your perspective. Also, as I said, if you're the only tester, you could create your Jira tickets for automation depth, and whenever you do have time to pick them up, do so. Apart from that, when you're working in the sprint, when you're doing estimates for the work you're going to do for the new features that you're implementing, always take into account that you want to do the automation. And so the estimates should reflect the fact that you will also add automation to the framework when you are testing the new features in the sprint. How would we know the framework is suitable? Well, it's going to be really easy to see whether you have successfully automated your scenarios. As I mentioned, you do the POC, the proof of concept. And if you manage to do the end-to-end scenarios, and as I said, you've managed to do the automation for the complex scenario, and it works properly, no random failures, it doesn't take a whole lot of time, then you would be able to figure out that it's the correct framework. If, let's say, for example, you've seen that the tests are very slow, you could try also picking a different framework to see whether that's better than the one you're using. So you could do a POC for some other framework also if you're not very happy with the first one. As I said, the two key factors always when it comes to the tests is that they are reliable and that they are running in a decent amount of time. So not 2 hours for a flow that you would manually do in maybe 2 minutes. Okay, what should we consider when starting automation? Which scenarios to automate? So here there's two things. First of all, let's say you're working on an automation project, but it's the software that you're testing is already there, but there was no automation ever. In this case, you need to prioritize the features. So you could take each of the features you want to automate and prioritize the scenarios you need to create. So, for example, you have the happy flow, and then you have all kinds of negative flows. The happy flow is always the highest priority. You always need to make sure that you validate that the software works as expected. And works as expected means the happy flow is there. Because, for example, if you're working on login, if the login is not working, but any other error that you might think of is thrown, that's really not going to help. So you need to make sure that the happy flow is working. And then after you've automated all of the happy flows for all of the features, you can start bringing in other features that are priority and just cover all the scenarios you have there. And if you're not exactly sure what feature has what priority, then you should just consult with your product owner or your business analyst who can tell you from a product perspective, from the stakeholder perspective, what is more important in terms of those features. Is it a good to have a combined framework for both end-to-end and integration? Well, you can create a framework for whatever you want. For example, you can create a framework in which you're doing mobile testing, in which you're doing API testing, and so on. The thing is, it doesn't matter how many frameworks you have, as long as you have a way of selecting what tests to run as part of different phases of the project. For example, if you have a project and it's a Java project and you're preparing a release for the API, you only want to run maybe API tests, then it's easy for you to run only the API tests, because you can select them from the packages where they are, because you've properly placed them in their correct packages, and then you can run only those particular tests. So there's no problem in having all kinds of tests in the same framework. At the same time, it's not bad to have them separate. It really depends on whether you would need parts that are common to both, because if you do, then it makes a good idea. It's a good idea to have them in the same place so that everybody can use the same utilities and you don't have to duplicate them from one project to the other one. Okay, I think last one, because we're out of time. Randomly failing tests fail randomly. How to know the reason for the failures? Sometimes you cannot find an explanation how to solve that in practical daily use. That's a good question. So yeah, the answer is I don't know exactly. So we can't really say, what is, like, there's not one solution for this problem. The only thing you can do is to do the debugging. So when you have your tests, run them as many times as you can, and then see what happens. See, for example, what user you are logged in when you were doing this. Try to reproduce the same scenario. Try to understand what was happening. Just try to reproduce what the test was doing, but also do the debugging on the test. Put breakpoints in different places of the test, just to find out as much information as you can. And so when you have this information, you can easier pinpoint where the problem is coming from, and you can adjust that. Most of the times in Selenium tests, for example, the problem is that we are not using weights. So we're just doing assertions instead of doing weights. One example, let's say you click on a button and you're expecting for a success message to be displayed. Once you've clicked on the button, the next line of code you have in your test says assert equals the message with the expected message. However, maybe when the code runs and the assertion is reached, the message did not yet come up, but if we had waited for 2 more seconds, it would have. So in this case, what I do is I don't use a lot of assertions, but instead I'm doing Selenium waits. So I'm waiting for the success message to be the expected one. And this way the test is way more reliable. And also what I'm doing when it comes to Selenium tests is that instead of directly using Selenium commands like click, type, and so on, I'm using wait-based commands. I'm waiting for the element to be properly clickable before I click on it. I'm waiting for the input that I'm typing into to be available before I'm typing into it, and so on. So all of my tests are just wait after wait after wait, and this is how I achieve reliability in my tests. Okay, so due to time, I will not be answering any more questions. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having so many questions, and I'm sorry I didn't get to answer them. And I do wish you a happy conference from now on. Enjoy, have fun.